you talked a little bit about Islamization of culture, and you mentioned Professor Al-Attas's 3 stages, and it seemed that didn't really, does that include culture? You know, because there were, I can't remember the stage, Islamization of the body, then the mind, then the soul. So how does the Islamization of culture come about? Because we're talking a lot about connecting with the Islamic tradition, but in this part of the world, one of the major accomplishments is the interaction with the Hindu-Buddhist tradition and the animistic tradition, and that the Malays, they didn't really identify as Malay in a narrow sense, that there was a very broad understanding of who they were, and they didn't alienate themselves, and we seem to be having a lot of issues with that now. They didn't alienate themselves from their, they connected themselves to their prophetic wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ, but they also engaged with the wisdom of the past. So you're mentioning the Wayang Kulit, they didn't just they did do what the Christian missionaries did in Indonesia, which is they used Islamic stories and things like that, but they were also confident enough to use Hindu stories, Hindu-Buddhist stories, and engage with that as well. The other thing is that this part of the world, I mean, Nusantara means islands in between, and implies exchange. How do we maintain our previous classical, Malay tradition, which is a beautiful tradition that we've inherited, while at the same time not allowing it to become, ossified, and allowing it to grow and interact with other communities of converts who are, from immigrant cultures, who want to enter into that culture, but they also want to bring their own cultural heritage. I mean, I'm half Chinese, half North Indian, so I want to bring that as well and be a part of that culture, and connect to this broader culture that you're speaking of. So I'll end it there.
You see, where culture is concerned, the Islamization of culture is concerned, remember that as defined in historical fact and fiction, Professor Al-Attas defines an Islamic culture or an Islamic civilization as the civilization that is born after the major elements of the worldview has been imbibed by the people, reflected in the language through the processes of Islamization, and then from that period onwards, whatever the inheritances of their past lives that doesn't contradict with this new system becomes preserved as part of the Islamic culture. And at the same time, they are also given the freedom. You see, this is to protect yourself from the dangers of ossification, to develop their own culture in their time. Culture, even as a term in English, reflects an organism. It is something living. It is not something like in the past. But we shouldn't be too critical of those people who want to, you see, bring back the Tanja and bring back all these other things. Why? Because we are not as critical about those people who bring back fashion trends in the West. So why should we be extra critical to our own culture? Yes? But to restrict our own culture to just that, now that's a danger. Yes? Because even in the West, they still have people who reenact, civil war, and there are people who are, who are, say, history buffs. They like the World War I, and they have memorabilia, and so on and so forth. We should be given the same freedom, at least. Yes? Because if we don't celebrate some of these fineries of cultures, because, again, bear in mind that some of these cultural products were the result of a generation that has fully imbibed the worldview of Islam. So that's why, say, for example, Unku Aziz and his late wife, they used to be a lover of pantuns, and they collect all the pantuns that they could, because these pantuns reflected a finer generation. Yes? A finer generation that could relay what they want in beautiful language in verse. Right now, you struggle, isn't it, just to string a sentence with with just, rhyming ends. Have you seen a thesis written in verse? In the intellectual tradition of the Hadramis, there are even works. For example, Imam Al-Haddad has written a qasidah ta'iyah, ainiyah. This means to say an entire ode, with very important sources for knowledge, history, and other disciplines, all ending with the letter ta. There is one that ends all with the letter ain. Yes? but it's, you see, in terms of meaning, it's not less profound. In fact, it is more profound than anything that we write now. But even in terms of its actual writing, in its verse, it's even more beautiful. There is even, I think, recorded in the works of Idrus al-Habshi, Habib Idrus al-Habshi, the Igdul Yawakit, yes? In this work, he wrote about some of the scholars in the past who challenged themselves to write, for example, a passage or a book that gathers together 6 sciences. The sciences would be written, if I have a board, basically line 1, meaning to say the horizontal line is one science, and it's composed of 6 words every line. Yes? 6 words every line, so that's one line. Or rather 5 words every line, and that's the horizontal line. So from the beginning to the end of the book, you get one science. Now, second science, you get from the first word downwards. How do you do that, isn't it? Second line, the third science. Fourth line, the fifth sign, and the fifth line, the 6th science. After a while, one scholar tried to up that. He did, and that was the max. After that, it was never rivaled again. An 8 line, reflecting 9 sciences. How can you do that? What sort of a mind can produce something like that? Even supercomputers have not done anything like that in our times, isn't it? So what's the big deal about, Kasparov being defeated in chess? The accomplishments of our scholars. It's a marvel, isn't it? How can you plan to write, it was said in the biography of Syed Hussein Al-Attas, the brother to Professor Naqib by the daughter. She said that his father, if you see the manuscripts, her father, if you see the manuscripts of his writing, he wrote with a pen. You cannot see it being cancelled. There was no liquid. It was not cancelled. That means to say everything was there first. He wrote it down. That's already a marvel in our time. Now these scholars, they do that while doing the things that we have done. So it's a truly major scientific accomplishment. And despite in their external sense being just normal. And there are even, for example, Nadam. Nadam, basically poetry or rhymed verse for each individual science. Yes, be it in Aqidah, in Tasawwuf, in Fiqh. Some of them, for example, will have 950 lines. 950 lines of rhyme. Where do you get that? These are incomparable minds. We haven't seen this. We don't see this anymore in our time. It cannot be surpassed by our generation. Even if, as Prof. Al-Attas said, even if you were to assemble a committee. Yes, the Lisanul Arab of Ibn Manzur, written by one man, 20 volumes. So, these are the sort of things that we should be privileging. And as for where culture is concerned, yeah, I do agree with you. I mean, people who come from various cultures, first, as supposing we say the source Islamic culture, which is the Malay culture, it in itself is already eclectic and syncretic in terms of it, gathering together the best words from all the neighboring languages, gathering together the best cultures from all the neighboring cultures. We should enrich, in order to escape this parochialism of our time. They should study history, basically. They should understand, for example, the source of law for the people in Perak, the source of law for people amongst the Minang, how the Sharia of Islam accommodated to these different ways of living. And this and the scholars who were, Malay civilization is one of the greater civilizations, because when the Arabs came and tried to Islamize this part of the world, they saw that these were already a respectable people to such an extent that a lot of its existing cultures were maintained. The language was preserved, a lot of the cultures were preserved. Very few cultures had to be just tweaked. Most of it left on its own. Yes, basically the effect of the worldview entering upon us didn't require Arabization, because as a people, this was already nearing an Islamic culture. An Islamic culture in the superior sense of the word. Yes, the ontology, the epistemology, the ethics. Oh, okay. Do you have only one page of that only says 5 minutes? Okay. So this is unlike, say, for example, some of the other cultures. Some of them, for example, in the Sudan and in some parts of Africa, they had to Arabize the culture also, because, for example, if some of these cultures were filled with too much superstition, if some of the ethics were so anti-humane, yes, for example, if it was too influenced by, say, tribalism, some of these cultures had to be Arabized, because the process of Islamization of the culture would be too slow. So it would be better for them to take on the culture of the Sahaba of the Prophet. But in this part of the world, our ways of interacting between males and female, our respect for the elders, these things, some of it are even more refined in the Malay culture. Yeah, for example, we have, is there an equivalent of abang in Arabic? No, isn't it? Abang, basically, somebody of more senior age, isn't it? That yes. So that means to say, even here, even age is a sort of a privilege. Somebody who's older is respected just by virtue of the fact that he's had, we ought to be soft on somebody who is more advanced and senior in age. Although that's part of Islamic culture, but we have even a word to symbolize it, isn't it? That somebody who's older is most respected like that. So if somebody came and wanting to introduce this, different and cultures, provided the person understands that these things doesn't destroy the fabric of the society, of the said society, it should be welcomed. But before it can be done, first you have to overcome the parochialism of that culture. You have to overcome the extremism that came ultimately as a result of lack of knowledge, ultimately lack of understanding. Because if you understood and you have internalized the Quranic framework, you would celebrate all the cultures, all the existing cultures as the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the acceptance of those which were influenced by shaitan.